Hi, and welcome to this week's Roundtable with Joey's Legacy. I'm Carrie Hyde, your host, and with me tonight we have Dr. Jean Dodds, Jerry Robb, and attorney Anna. We just talked about this, didn't we? I knew it would mess me up. Say your last name for me.
Morrison Riccardotti.
Riccardotti. She just gave me this cute little way to do it, and I said, "Oh, now I'll never forget." So, Dr. Jean Dodds, if you don't know, is a world-renowned veterinarian who speaks a lot about the pet industry. And if you're local, if you're one of my listeners and you're local here in Orange County, you should know that she is one of the veterinarians that I refer all of my clients to because she is just so fabulous. Dr. Dodds, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here. It's so great to have you here and be a part of this group with me. So it's awesome. We also have with us Jerry Robb, who is the author of Joey's Legacy, the collection of horrible stories of pets who have lost their lives through veterinary malpractice. Jerry, did we lose you?
Oh no.
Well, we lost Jerry. I'm sure he'll be back in. So, and of course, with us, we have one of the fabulous attorneys that is part of Joey's Legacy, and we couldn't do this without our veterinarians and our attorney. Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And just taking your time out and coming out here, both of you. This organization wouldn't be able to continue going without you. So it's just amazing. And I wanted to start this off before some of our questions of the followers and listeners come on with asking you a question, Dr. Dodds. I always ask this, and I always ask if our veterinarians that are on here, and I probably asked you again, but for our new listeners, have you ever witnessed veterinary malpractice? So I ask that all the time because some of our listeners are listening and they haven't been a victim of it. And I think one of our struggles with getting this organization we want to get this documentary made, which is what we talk about a lot, is how much we need this documentary. And I think a lot of the people who follow or listen may think that veterinary malpractice is rare. And while I think it's rare that animals are dying through veterinary malpractice, and maybe you would disagree or agree with me, I think veterinary malpractice happens daily. It just doesn't always result in death, and sometimes people don't even know what happens to them. Would you agree with that statement?
I agree. Yes, many people are unaware of what's going on, and part of the problem with working outside the acceptable broad ranges of practice is that they don't necessarily read what's going on today, especially that have graduated 20 or more years ago, may not be keeping up on what's going on and what's going on. And recently to be asked to write a molecular update on what's going on with bleeding diseases that are heritable pets, which I've spent my life studying. And the two rejected my paper, one from Greece and one from Poland, because they'd never heard of me. The problem, I didn't know what I was doing. And why was I reviewing what's already been published? Well, it was a review. That was the whole point.
Wow.
Physical expression of disease to understanding genetics, go into the of the disease, and then try to do gene therapy or other things to correct it. That's what it was about. And I felt so embarrassed that they did, because I'm much older than they are, and the journal told me who they were, which they I was able to realize that before they.
Wow.
So they don't have a background, and the whole point of the review was to look at how have taken us from to molecular nanotechnology, which is so amazing, right?
Yeah.
So they said, well, are you going to rebut it and resubmit it? I said, no, I don't need another paper. I wasn't going to, there's no point in do their homework. The journalists have to be more careful when they select reviewers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think we live in I hate to say this, a lot of our younger generation really is looking at, well, how much do I know you? If I don't know you, that doesn't make your information not valuable.
Correct.
Our experience alone should make it valuable. But I hear that too. Well, what have you done? Who are you?
Yeah.
Because we're
All
so
you have to do is ask the question. I'm not familiar with the back. Please explain, you know,
yeah.
what you've done and why it's important for us today.
Well, when
Right?
they finally figure out who Dr. Jean Dodds is, I hope they're going to be embarrassed.
Oh, I don't know. You very over the years received a couple of people that have written to me and said they were embarrassed and they were very sorry. And one person, an internal medicine specialist here when I first moved to California, exactly that. And I said, well, I'm certainly not going to try to explain who I am. Why don't you ask your mentor? So she asked Dr. X, and I got an email from this young person saying, I am so sorry,
Wow.
which was so I still refer patients to her because the guts to say she didn't know, you know?
Those are the best doctors, whether you're
Yes.
Yes,
human or veterinarian, the doctor
right.
who can say, or we could take it out of the medical field and even
Yeah,
attorney to say,
sure.
I don't know. If you can find that person, that to me is just incredible because that's the person who's learning from their mistakes,
100%.
right?
100%.
So
Yeah.
it's
So the
important.
problems are human frailty, not nothing else, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we always start this off a little bit with a little explanation about it's important that our listeners know that veterinary malpractice does happen and that it's happening more frequently than they know. And it's probably happened to most people's animals. I've witnessed it many, many times. But people often think of the word veterinary malpractice or malpractice as it needing to be something very extreme, like death. So can you define before we get into some of these questions so that'll help maybe guide the questions a little bit about what malpractice is and maybe the difference between malpractice and negligence?
That's for Anna.
Yes, Anna.
Sure, no problem. And veterinary malpractice. I know malpractice sounds kind of more sinister, but really, it's basically veterinary negligence. It's just a different standard because, like, you or I can be negligent for something. Like, let's say I drop a bottle on the floor and I didn't clean it up, or I didn't do what a reasonable person would have done and clean it up, and then someone slips on it. It's my fault. I'm negligent for doing that. I didn't mean for someone to get hurt from that, but I didn't take the proper steps that I, as a regular person, should have taken to make that right, to fix the mistake I made. But with veterinarians, because they have a different level of knowledge, they have a higher level of knowledge, so they're held to a higher standard, and so they have standards of conduct, or basically, what you look at in a malpractice case is whether or not the veterinarian's conduct fell below the reasonable standards of care. So if they didn't meet those standards of care, then they're going to be responsible. They're going to have committed an act of malpractice. Now, in the law, whether you can be compensated for that, or whether you can actually um, do something in the civil courts, depends on your damages. So it has to be that there was a breach of the standard of care, and but for that breach, your animal wouldn't have been harmed, because there's disciplinary committees that will look at standards of care and breaches, but they look at it just for the discipline, to say, like, well, they didn't do this right, so maybe we should talk to them, or find out something we can do to make them better. But when it's a person like you or I, that their animal may have been harmed by a veterinarian, then there has to be both the breach and the damages. And when you look at cases, involving veterinary malpractice, you need to have another veterinarian, of a similar kind of background, or, in that same area, because there are subspecialties and there's all sorts of different, standards, like for specialists, people who maybe hold themselves out as, maybe they're a dental specialist, or maybe they're some kind of like a cancer specialist. They're held to an even higher standard of care, or a different standard of care, that that makes them, like, if they commit a mistake, or if they make a mistake with the knowledge, they look at what a veterinarian with that same knowledge would have done, and whether there's a breach. But you really do have to have that and the damages for a civil case. So that's kind of where we're at. But I
Yeah.
what's interesting, and I know Dr. Dodds may have a kind of comment on this, but what I've seen in some of the cases we've had more recently is that general practitioner veterinarians have been trying to do things that specialists or only specialists should be doing. And that causes a problem because you're still, they're still going to be held to what the specialists, at least in a lot of situations, would be held to, even though they don't have that, they don't have that knowledge. And, they shouldn't have maybe attempted something that required a specialist. But with all of this, I should say that these things vary state by state. So when you're looking at the legal analysis of it, you've got to talk to an attorney in your state, in your jurisdiction, your county, because the laws differ in how these are specifically applied. There's like general principles, and then there's a very specific application, and that's what can vary.
Yeah.
That in the several cases I've got, that we've had a very serious issue because, first of all, the people have suffered, and they've had a huge bill as well, and they're grieving, and they're gonna pay help because that anger actually diffuses reality. And so, like you just said, it can be different states have different standards, and they say, well, that's only hearsay legally. You can't. Person told me, when you don't have any writing or proof that they said what they said. So the problem is it isn't that there wasn't necessarily negligence, it's that the caregiver doesn't understand the legal huge broad within the practice. Even though you and I might not do that, it's still within the defined standard within that region, for example. So I have this all the time, and I tell people, but that's hearsay. That's legal.
Well, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Go.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, hearsay is, I'll explain that. It's a little tricky, that term, because hearsay really just means like an out of court statement taken for truth. Like they told me this or they told me that, but
Yes.
really more what it is it's there's a certain amount of discretion that's allowed in like a professional. So if you reach a fork in the road, like say that there's like your animal comes in, they're sick, maybe they have diarrhea, they have they're vomiting, and you say, well, they could either have this, they might have a stomach problem, or they might have something else, an underlying blood disorder. You do all the tests, and it's still equally possible they could have one thing wrong or something else. If the veterinarian just picks A versus B as the course of action, and that turns out to be wrong, it doesn't mean they committed an act of malpractice simply because they made the wrong choice. It just means that they made the wrong choice. It's actionable if most of the veterinarians, if the veterinarians, if they're like, whoa, there's no way I would have picked choice A. I would have, absolutely would have picked choice B. There were tons of things they should have looked at. They should have gone with B. That's when you go into malpractice. But the key, it's important to realize there too, is that it's not that they intended to do it wrong. It's that they made a mistake. That's what malpractice is. And it comes to be a big issue with juries also, because sometimes juries don't like to hold professionals, and I don't know why, but they don't like to hold them responsible unless it was an intentional act. And that that rarely happens. It really only happens usually when somebody's trying to cover up something they did or they did wrong. But with malpractice, it's what the veterinarian typically looks at when we have to, we submit records to a veterinarian to review. They look at the actual documents from the doctors, the words themselves, the words like their records, what the veterinary doctors put down in the writing. That's what they look at. They will sometimes look at what was told to a person. So that could be hearsay, meaning that they, in a sense of like, they told me this, which is really kind of an admission against interest if it's taken as truth. But the veterinarians can look at the timeline that a client or a companion animal's guardian submits, but they look at that kind of secondarily more for things like failure to inform. But I will tell you, there have been instances where we found veterinary records that have been changed and altered, or they are not inputted the same day. That's why when we tell people the best practice is every time you go to a veterinarian, get those records that day and get them, get everything you need that day, because if something happens later, you don't necessarily have access to their computer system. You don't know how much access they have, when they can make those changes. And every time we've gotten into a legal fight over it, the attorneys representing the veterinarians in their veterinary offices, do not want to tell us, the software providers. They don't want to tell us how those records are kept. And so it becomes a fight. And that's where it kind of gets tricky.
Yeah, right.
But basically, yes.
But so many people, Anna, say, I didn't know that I could get the records. And so they
Right.
pick them up. But what I'm saying about hearsay is the people are so upset and angry. What they're hearing may not be what was said. We don't know either way. I'm not supporting either side.
Right.
They said this, but they may not have understood it. When a very upset and emotional, they may not be listening to what the people are trying. The people that are trying to tell them feel like to say it. Everybody's in a stress situation. It's difficult.
No, that's fair. Yeah, and usually, like, most of the time, the records that are taken, like, contemporaneous for when the actions are done, those are usually taken, I wouldn't say as true, but generally is a baseline where to go. It's only when you see that the records were altered later, or they weren't entered at the same time, that they were taken down, is when you start to question it. And that's what we've seen kind of more often. And a lot of it is because, with kind of the tendency towards the corporate practice, the veterinarians have like a sheet where there's like automatic fills, in these forms that are filled out. So you'll read it and you'll be like, wait a minute, they weren't in for a spay neuter. That doesn't make any sense, or something like that. But it's an auto fill form. So it kind of leads you to question, whether these vet records are accurate or not. But those are all things that the veterinarian can actually look at and say, hey, this animal's 7 years old. They were spayed back when they were 1. This is clearly not an accurate record, and they can point that out. And it's usually when we find errors in the records that it's the veterinarians who are reviewing them. But it's true. People, they may not, regular people, because like we don't, any one of us, we're not veterinarians, so we don't do this every day, and we sometimes maybe have a hard time hearing what the veterinarian's going to say to us.
Sure.
And that's why the veterinarians will write it in their records. It's only like, yeah. I see the worst of it. So I think like my perception of it is a bit more skewed. So
let me really quickly, for our listeners, I'm just going to give some people are new listening to this. This is live all over Instagram and Facebook pages everywhere. So Joey's Legacy, really quick, is an organization that was formed from the loss of a little dachshund named Joey, who lost his life due to veterinary malpractice. The owner of Joey started this organization called Joey's Legacy. And what Joey's Legacy does is it brings together veterinarians and attorneys and pet parents who may have been victims of veterinary malpractice. How it works is you would initially send in what you think may have happened, and one of our veterinarians, like Dr. Jean Dodds, would review it, look at it to see if the standard, which is what Anna, our attorney, was talking about, was the standard of care not where it should be. So Dr. Dodds would be able to look at that and say, oh yeah, I wouldn't, as Anna was explaining, have done B, I would have done A, and this is what I would have done. And then once that happens, and one of the veterinarians says, yeah, this looks like it might be veterinary malpractice, it gets sent over to our attorneys, and that's when the attorneys take over. So that's what Joey's Legacy does. And that's why we're here. This is why this organization has been put together. As Dr. Dodds has mentioned, I have said many times on the show, I've witnessed veterinary malpractice back in my days as a vet tech, and every single veterinarian that's in this organization has seen it. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dr. Dodds, is your opinion on why do you think veterinarian malpractice? One of the things that Anna had said is that it's really rare that no one's going purposely out of their way to do veterinary malpractice. Why do you think it happens? What do you think, or maybe, I think there's lots of reasons, but what do you think the main reason why we're continuing?
Well, I think with the effect of the pandemic, all our lives have changed. And so many veterinarians could not actually directly see the pet and the pet caregiver at the same time. The technician comes out and gives them a recommendation, brings the animal into the clinic. The veterinarian or veterinarians examine the animal. Sometimes the veterinarian's got an emergency. A technician is examining them. They're talking about it. They come out to the pet care, say, this is what we think it is. This is what it's going to be. We're told. you have to be able to see someone and look at them directly. Look at the, I mean, we're an emergency medical able. We've never closed. We've always allowed to have pets come in, and when we couldn't come in, we had a canopy outside in a parking lot, and the pet was with us the whole time with our veterinarian, but a special facility. So we were lucky in that regard, in that we were always able to look at people and tell them what to do. Some people that said, I hear what you say, like vaccine, believe in vaccines, so I'm not going to do it. So wait a minute, parvovirus epidemic, and we don't believe in vaccines. I'm okay with it, but my wife won't. So I said, okay, so do we fire that client? Do we tell, we get the information, we tell them, 2 months later they say, okay, we've changed our mind, we'll come in to get the vaccines. They never kept the appointment.
Yeah.
We feel terrible for that puppy. You know, these people have been themselves that affects another living being. God forbid, a child or another animal, right? And won't follow what we all know is the standard of practice.
Well, I think a lot of times what happens, you know, it's all or nothing world that we live in. And so when someone like Dr. Dodds says, and correct me if I'm wrong, if Dr. Dodds says, you know, the Bordetella vaccine is not a good idea, and then they take that as a whole for every vaccine is not a good idea.
Yeah.
And it really is a case by case situation.
Absolutely.
Right.
So,
without commenting about the clinically critical disease, virus and rabies by law.
right.
It's a huge issue in San Diego now that we've got. It's such bunk. Seriously, people wrote me and said, "What do you think?" I said, "Bunk." He said, "I agree."
Yeah.
This is the second vaccine likely to cause acute hypersensitivity reactions.
Right.
They're so fuzzy, you can't believe. The
So,
whole world and all the news media are going on about it.
well, see, this is such a really good, like if we talk about rabies right now or leptospirosis, which both have high chances, probability of your pet having a reaction to it, that a veterinarian by law has to give that vaccine. So if a veterinarian gives this to your pet and your pet dies, it's not malpractice.
Right.
And that's where the emotion, you know, comes into play, is then people will go read about how horrible the rabies vaccine is, and then they want to blame the veterinarian. But Anna, have you seen these cases?
Well, yeah, and I think there's a caveat there too, because one, I think Dr. Dodds makes a really important point about like how the veterinarians can really only do what the owners consent to. And that's a tough pill sometimes to swallow when you can see that the owners are either not understanding or simply don't. There are some people that will just walk out and say, I don't want to spend $2,000, and so I will simply let my animal die. And it's devastating and sad to hear about. But when it comes to the vaccines, there's certain vaccines that are, you know, law mandated, and we've seen all that stuff in the news, you know, about the rabies here. I think the international one was extremely overblown, but that said, you know, with rabies vaccine, a veterinarian can, at least in most all states, you know, it's the veterinarian who can step in and say, look, your animal is either too sick, is compromised, or some reason should not get that vaccine. But that's not for every animal. That's just, you know, whether your animal is in a particularly bad state. Like if your animal's getting chemotherapy, not a really good time to get a rabies vaccine. And I have actually seen veterinarians make mistakes where they say, well, no, I have to give this vaccine. It's like, no, you don't. There's an exception in the law that allows it. So it can be malpractice for a veterinarian to give a vaccine when it shouldn't be given.
Yeah, especially when the label says only for healthy pets. So what we do, we issue in Southern California, public health veterinarians refuses any exemption. So we defer it. Not healthy. So we defer it for 3 months, and then in 3 months it's not healthy, we defer it because we sign an oath that we will when we know that it's not safe for this animal to do it. Now for leptospirosis, I mean, thing. It's not mandated. So the issue is, are these strains of leptospirosis that they claim are causing so much harm actually doing what they're doing? And there's not good evidence that they are. Mindset of veterinary medicine and veterinary public health that vaccines are perfectly safe, they don't cause reactions. Look at the people that won't get a vaccine, right? Because they say it causes clots. Well, you know, you have this issue with the J&J vaccine. 50 to 60 people out of 11.5 million minor clots, and one person actually passed away that had very serious other illnesses. The problem was those were people congenitally or familially deficient in the surface of their blood platelets that protected them against clots. So they had a molecular defect in their bodies susceptible to having a clot form with this vaccine. 11.5 million, and the whole world went berserk. I'm not going to use this vaccine anymore. That's totally ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
It does go to, like, I think it is a bigger underlying condition now where people are not as trusting. You know, like they don't do their research. They don't know. Maybe if they do the research, they don't know how to understand it, and you know, they're kind of going with the loudest talker as opposed to the one that's most knowledgeable and really able to give a good answer, which is kind of sad.
Look at the personal protection. They don't wear masks. They won't. They don't. You're not doing anything. Did you see the University of Virginia just refused acceptance to people coming into the university that wouldn't wear a mask?
Yeah.
Said, forget it. You're not coming in here with it. You have to think not just about yourself, but all the other people that you're around that could be susceptible to have other diseases, be elderly or be very young and be immunocompromised. It's about society and helping each other.
Yeah.
I should add, with the Dr. Dodds, have you seen like the crossover? Because like COVID, you know, is a zoonotic disease. And, you know, has there been much talk, you know, of crossover from, you know, human to animal?
No,
you know,
only cats, big cats. Not with that whole crossover issue was not true. Hamsters are at risk, and primarily cats. Remember they killed and mink. Remember they killed all those mink in the Netherlands?
Yeah.
Because they were going to be infectious to people. Not that we should be growing mink anymore. Never mind. That's another issue.
I'm with you.
Let's go back to one of the problems I think is actually happening with regards to standard of care. So we had one of the other fabulous attorneys on, and he was talking about the difference between the standard of care in human and the standard of care in veterinarians. And he makes this really fabulous point that veterinarians, like, I forget what his numbers were, but it was something like if you had 10 doctors, human doctors, and 9 of them would make this decision, or I think he might have said 8, then that's the standard of care. But with veterinarians, it's a little bit lower because they're dealing with animals who cannot speak, and there's all these other factors that go into play. But do you think one of the problems, Anna or Dr. Dodds could probably answer this, is that it's weird because I'm a huge advocate that animals should be seen as more than just property. But on the other side, I think it is fair that veterinarians aren't held to the same standards as a human would be for the very reason that they can't speak to their patients. But because it makes it another element, right? I'm trying to figure out how to treat something that can't tell me everything. But I wonder if people want the standard of care to be identical to what humans' standard of care is.
But children can't. Their guardian or parents have to speak for them. So there's a parallel there. I mean, I don't think the standard of care should be different. The problem is that society doesn't give animals the same value as they do people, okay? And even at the government level, and we know that. And we can perhaps accept that. I mean, I don't like it, and people like you and Anna don't like it. And even Jerry probably doesn't like it. But the fact of the matter is a human standard is a higher level. I mean,
right. But
for
I think
rabies,
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of room for objective criteria though as well, because like you don't hear as much about rounding or like checking with other doctors before making their decisions final, before
Other side.
advising the human guardian, as to what they should do for their animal. And that I think is where, it's not really going to progress as quickly as probably we need. So it's more that the consumer, of the veterinary services, are going to have to do more research and know what, ask questions, get second opinions, do the things that, you might do if it were your own health or your, or someone else that, that maybe you're concerned that they are not going to speak as much. But I mean, the human guardians of these companion animals, I mean, they see them every single day. They're usually going to, they're going to bring them in and say, look, I've noticed they're walking a little funny. I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but I really would kind of like the x-ray, or I'd like to know if there's something, just to get a baseline. And I think they're going to just need to be more proactive. But I see your point in that, yes, this is a different species, it's a different different type of analysis. But I think there's enough objective criteria, and I think a lot of the vets, especially those that have experience, can see these issues because they do come up again. And even people will hide their their issues. They'll go to a doctor and they'll say, oh, no, I feel fine. They're not
Yeah,
fine.
right.
The doctor knows they're not fine.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
and more pet owners need to have, pet caregivers need insurance so they can afford to have it. They need to really buy pet insurance. And there's an example with rabies. The World Health Organization says that a rabies titer of national units in the serum protect a person against rabies. The World Health Organization. The states by CDC is zero 0.1 international units per mil. So people rabies titer on a pet that if they have less than but 0.1 or higher, that they have to or be put to sleep. When in fact the CDC standard is different than the World Health Organization standard, and most people don't know that.
Wow.
so with the whole goal here, Joey, is, and we've talked about it many times, is changing the laws, because we think that by doing so, we really, for those of you who don't know, your pets are seen as property in the eyes of the law right now. So if
Right.
Anna has a case and your pet, you're become a victim of veterinary malpractice, it's it's hard cases to win because they're just considered property, and so we need to change that. And so we keep looking at ways that we can do that. And I don't know if you all have read this article, or Dr. Dodds, if you've seen it. The AVMA just came out against changing the law to make pets, and they gave this reason why, and they argue, which to me was kind of a good thing to read, because I feel like the pressure might be coming away towards them a little bit, because the article says, well, you don't want that, pet parents. You don't want them to be seen more than property, because then veterinary care will get too expensive and nobody will be able to afford it.
That's
Have you seen that article, or do you have any comments?
It's called the ostrich effect. Carrie, bury your head in the sand. Okay.
yeah, I don't agree, because first off, like the malpractice insurance for veterinarians is actually not very high, and they have pretty good, like a lot of them have like $500,000 coverage. So
Yeah.
there are no cases that get that high unless you're really doing something astronomically bad and it with intention. So I mean, their insurance companies are really the ones driving this. And I think AVMA, I don't know if they use PLIT or whoever it is, but they AVMA always comes out because they're in a great position right now. I mean, who do you know that pays, thousands of dollars to bring their toaster back to health? Nobody. But they like to go with this, oh, they're just property. They're property like a table chair or a toaster, and they're not. And what's nice is that there have been some strides in the law. It's just that most of these strides have come in the intentional side, like for animals that have been beaten, have been abused. There the law will go after the abuser, and they'll say, like, yeah, well, this animal, you clearly knew that this animal was bonded, had a bond to somebody. And they're really kind of allowing it to help the person whose animal was hurt, because they know that that person has a bond with that animal and that was emotional distress. And so there are a lot more laws in a lot more states, Illinois included, that if somebody intentionally harms your animal, then yeah, you can go after for real damages, like for Illinois has the Humane Care for Animals Act. And if somebody tortures or abuses in a way that fits within that act, they're going to have to pay for your attorney's fees. They're going to have to pay for punitive damages, anywhere from $500 to $25,000 per act, and they have to pay for all of the veterinary care to try to help that animal and the person's emotional distress for that animal's loss. But when it comes to the negligence, the courts have kind of leaned back on like, oh, well, they're property. So like if you get in a car wreck and your car is destroyed, and say your car costs $10,000, the court's not going to allow you $50,000 to bring your $10,000 car back to restore it. They're going to say, here's money to go get yourself another car that's worth $10,000. But the trend, more trending has been, especially because people have realized like our animals are not tables, toasters, and chairs. The courts are recognizing kind of more of what's called actual value. And it was something that it's value to owner. Now, what that means specifically is it's not like you're going to get the same amount, for the loss of a spouse or loss of a child or something like that. The court realizes that this is their expectations are different. Animals don't live as long, or non-human animals don't live as long as people. You're not necessarily expecting a longer, life than that. But they do recognize that the bonds are strong, and that they recognize that people have a deep moral, commitment to taking care of their companion animals. And the reason I say companion animals is because the AVMA fought the term companion animal. They didn't even like that to be used. I have to find it, but I have some articles from a long time ago where they preferred the use of pet because it's more distant. It's more like, furniture or something to that end. But we all know animals are not furniture, and you don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to have the degrees that Dr. Dodds had to see that, I hit my table, it doesn't cry. I step on my cat's tail and they're going to be pretty upset. They're going to be mad at me. And, that you can see that animals have their own societies. They have their own interactions. And the fact that we don't recognize that, I think it's really sad. But the law, already recognizes certain things, and it's expanding. But there's going to be a hard push against it by the veterinarians or I shouldn't say that. No, I don't mean Dr. Dodds and, inclusive, because there are many veterinarians who understand that, but for these bonds that we have with our animals, there would be no veterinary service. My toaster breaks, I throw it away.
They're also getting a lot of the recent awards are also emotional stress to the person who lost a pet. In other words, the pet may be considered property and you get $600. I'm just making up a number, but you have emotional distress in addition of that. Or they'll submit their bills and they'll look at it and they'll give them some explanation for that. The AVMA is not the veterinary medicine that has a very, I've been a member for 56 years. I'm a, what do we call, honor roll member. I don't have to pay dues anymore. Whoopee doopie. And why do I stay a member? Because that way I can I write letters to the editor.
But that's
as long as you don't say anything pejorative,
That's one of the reasons, like we tell people, like if your animal has been harmed or killed by a veterinarian, you're pretty sure that have the cells preserved. Now, you may not want to clone your animal or anything like that, but the reason if you rarely get a chance to interact with somebody, usually it's long after that where they've not been told about freezing cells and that. But if the veterinarians want to argue that this is a market value, so here's $200, go buy another dog. Well, you can say, well, I don't want to buy another dog. If I'm going to get the exact same genetic dog, I'm going to clone them, and that's $50,000. So if they want to argue market value, which, understandably, most of our, pet people aren't going to necessarily want because that's not the same animal. But if they want to argue it, then we have an argument. But I think the trend would
look at the veterinarian in Texas that shot an arrow through that cat's head and then bragged about it online. She lost her license.
And she should.
Wait. Huh? Yeah, but not initially.
Yeah, and some of the things I see, it's just discouraging.
That's horrible.
Yeah,
horrible.
Because but that's like one instance where you see that the disciplinary bodies actually stepped in. A lot of times they don't. A lot of times it's, it's a hard push to get them to take action, because they're, people that have been used to this model of like, okay, I'll pay a whole lot to bring my toaster back to health, but oh, that's just a toaster. And but the younger, I think there is like a give and take, because the younger generations, as they're coming up, as attorneys and judges, and that they are recognizing that animals play our companion animals play a much different role in our lives than maybe they used to. And they're recognizing that, maybe their bond with their dog was far closer to either one of their parents, maybe, or, what have you. But that's something that there's a recognition that these bonds are real and they need to be valued. And for a veterinarian to simply say, after it was their mistake and your animal's dead, oh, well, I don't value your bond. It's just pure hypocrisy. Pure hypocrisy.
It is pure. And that's the point that you have made a lot on here, is you're charging as if it is more than a toaster until you mess up, and then you want me to change my viewpoint on the animal that you were charging me accordingly to. It's such a good point.
And
But
it's not
go
enough
ahead.
to just give you back the money you paid in, because you get nothing then for that bond. It's like, okay, so you're basically going to pay me back all the money I paid you to make a mistake. No, that's not enough either, because there's no disincentive. But what I also see, and this is the part that makes me really upset, is that not every veterinarian does things, pure of heart. I mean, and I guess that's the question, is that you have to understand that veterinarians are very highly revered practice. They're usually very well liked, not like attorneys. Attorneys, take attorneys to court, they're probably not going to do so well if they're the defendant. But I mean, veterinarians, most people think, oh, well, you must love animals, so you certainly don't want to hurt them. But there are veterinarians that, for whatever reason, maybe they have decided they needed more money. Maybe they've crammed their practice full so that they could make more. We even have a veterinarian who removed a microchip from a stolen cat. So for, and the microchips, they're like $30 to $60. The surgery to remove it was like, the whole shebang was close to like $1,000. So when you look at things like this and you realize that not everybody's acting pure of heart, and sometimes it's harder to convince others that that's the truth. That's what you're fighting when you're going into these cases, because you're fighting a system that doesn't necessarily want to change. You're like, oh, we don't want them considered anything more than property, but we do want your money, thank you.
Yeah.
But and then to say that you would ever bring your animal in, I mean, it's not like it's not that just breeders or show animals or what have you. It's not simply a market that's driving it to the extent of oh gosh, we only want the purest bred animals. No, people like the animals they get at the shelter, and they are absolutely happy. They're treated like kings in their homes, and that should be understood and valued.
We have to start, preparing everybody. I think, we just had a case on here we talked about, I think last week we did a special with a pet guardian who lost his dog Glocky. I don't know if any of you heard about this story, but the pet passed away from heat exhaustion at a doggy daycare. And it was interesting. I'm kind of interested as to what Dr. Dodds would say about this. So the pet is taken to the veterinary hospital and passes away there. And the veterinarian said that, put the dog on ice, as they do. And then when the owner asked to get a necropsy, they said they couldn't because the dog was on ice, and that now they can no longer do that.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Right. And so I questioned whether there was a relationship between the boarding facility and the veterinarian, and they were trying to hide it, which to me seemed kind of really sad, because I don't think, not that this means doggy daycare intention was heat exhaustion. I think they just are ill prepared to handle it when it happened and how to prevent it. But now it's turned into so much more once that veterinarian prevents him from finding out the actual cause of death. But it just, like, that's the kind of stuff that continues to go on, and I don't know how we stop it. So we have to start preparing people. You always want to get a necropsy. right?
Always.
Like you have to get it, if not to get the answers of
Yeah, for
whether
heat stroke, can't see anything unless the animal had some abnormal or internal organ thing that made the dog susceptible to intravascular clotting, thrombosis, in other words, because of heat stroke. And necropsy is important, and the fact that it was on ice has nothing to do.
yeah.
But if it was just stroke and a healthy, otherwise healthy animal, you wouldn't see anything.
Yeah, and I think that's it's not necessarily for that particular case, but making people aware that
Yeah, sure.
you have to ask for your records. You have to, and
Right.
it's so hard when we're going through it, and you think, like Anna pointed out, most times people think their veterinarians went all the way through vet school and they love their animals. And I'm here to tell you, I worked for a veterinarian that did not like animals. I don't know why he was a vet. He hated animals. He couldn't stand them and complained all the time. Now, I obviously think that's the small percentage, but we do have these situations. So you have to be prepared every time. Get your records, ask questions, get a necropsy. You're just going to have to, because we
But
don't have much without it, right?
yeah, even if you don't get an answer from the necropsy, it shows that you took the reasonable steps to try to find out. And
Right.
Oh,
that's
no, for
where
sure,
it's
100%.
important.
Yeah, I didn't mean not.
Yeah.
Sometimes you won't find anything, which
Right.
is good because that shows you that it was just heat stroke and not some other comorbidity that caused the animal.
Right.
It still doesn't change the fact that the animal is not with us anymore. It's
Right.
still very sad.
Yeah, that's one thing that
But people still leave dogs in cars with it,
the
right?
other side
They still
they'll
do.
often lean on whatever they can, and if they'll say, well, you didn't get a necropsy, so they might have had cancer for all we know. And
Yes.
as absurd as that may sound for an otherwise healthy animal, it's something that if you don't have that necropsy to show that nope, it wasn't that, that somebody will try to use, and that's sad.
Which in this case, that's exactly what we could have ruled out, because we really do believe it's heat stroke. I don't think anyone is even questioning it, but it would have been, he was not an old dog and had a recent health check not too far back. I want to say it was 6 months before he went in. So, I mean, everything points to heat stroke, but now they can't, the other side can argue it could have been anything. And so that's why these necropsies are so important, and sometimes they're going to show nothing, right? Sometimes they're
Right.
going to tell, and you're going to be able to go home and say, okay, it wasn't the veterinarian's fault. And that's going to,
A third of human autopsies and animal
nothing.
Yeah.
Third?
Yeah, about a third.
Wow. But it helps cases. It helps us kind of understand it. And like I said, sometimes it can help a pet parent just feel better, because
Sure.
I was speaking with Lori, is behind the scenes here helping out, but we were talking about why people in general, but particularly I see it a lot in my world, in my industry, pet related, whether it's veterinarian, doggy daycares, trainers, boarders, where they feel this weird feeling of lying because they don't want to tell the truth, because they're I'll give you an example. Boarding facilities are notorious for this, where the pet parent drops off the dog and the dog doesn't want to eat his dinner that night, so he doesn't eat the dinner, so the boarding facility just throws it away and tells the owner everything's fine and go about your day. And the reason they do that, and the only reason I'm bringing this up, is because I think on some levels as a society, we need to get better at accepting the truth and not putting blame on somebody. And the more we keep blaming people for things like, that's not the boarding facility's fault that the dog didn't want to eat, but because the pet parents spend an awful lot of time blaming. Well, what did you do to him? Why didn't he want to eat? He always eats. And then it just starts going, and I see it in this industry all the time. And it's difficult. The reason I know about that, Dr. Dodds, is I've had to retrain people that have come from other boarding facilities that we don't do that. We just explain to the pet parent. Sometimes they don't eat on their first night of boarding or whatever.
For sure.
But I feel like a lot of times that's why we have veterinarians and in the pet industry tend to lie. And I'm not making excuses for them, but I also want pet parents to know that collectively we should all kind of be able to accept the truth when it's given to us as well, and let that be sometimes, because it's not always someone's fault, right? I mean, sometimes dogs just die. They get older and they die, and it's not someone's fault. But I know that's kind of took us off track, but it's something I talked to Scott about recently, that this is such a hard thing for me to do this, to be part of Joey's legacy, because I don't want to give people more excuses to blame their veterinarians, but I also want it to stop the veterinary malpractice. So I'm in this middle ground place where it's difficult, because the emotions, as Dr. Dodds brought up, become so strong, and then you get tunnel vision, and some people will go to their attorneys, right, and they'll just throw money, and they want the attorneys to just keep going and going and going and going and going and going when there's not anybody's
You know,
fault.
you can suggest to the parent that they contact a practitioner in animal and have that animal communicator talk to the pet. And often the pet will say, hey, I was hurting. You didn't know. I didn't want you to know. I am very happy now, and I'm waiting to greet you again. You know, you can have situations like that where the pet will say, hey, I'm fine. Our cat was a big cat came in. We had a feral cat, and she wouldn't let anybody, me and my husband, but she would sleep on my neck at night. If Charles got up to go to the pillow. Anyway, she chased all the feral cats out of the backyard, always. Giant black cat. And the black cat said, chase me. And it turned out it wasn't a cat at all. It was a coyote.
Oh, wow.
And it killed her.
Oh, no.
And a neighbor found her. I talked to the communicator, and Sherry, her name, hey, it was my fault. The cat, but it was the coyote. I'm fine.
Wow.
That's sad.
Yeah.
I still think of her at night.
But
She had 3.5 years living with us, you know.
Yeah, it's just like I said, it's a hard emotional thing, and sometimes it leads us down the wrong paths.
Yeah.
And knowing all of what we can do, working with the right people, I think is important, because you do, Anna, I'm sure you've had cases, Dr. Dodds, I know you have had cases where it isn't veterinary malpractice. How do you handle those, Anna, when someone comes to you and says, I know this is, and you've got a veterinarian telling you not? How do you handle those?
you just can't take, I mean, that's one of the reasons that, having professional malpractice, I mean, honestly, it doesn't really matter if it's like a veterinary malpractice, human malpractice, accounting, something, wherever you're dealing with professionals, you want another professional in that same industry to be reviewing it, because there's things you're not going to be able to know. Like, I won't know the details of what to look for in a veterinary record. But that's why, like, for us, the very first step in the screening of a case is to have those records reviewed. And, a lot of times people, will say the things like, like what we talked about at the beginning here of like, well, they told me this and that. And it's like, okay, well, we'll have a timeline. You write a timeline, and then we'll submit that with the records. But the first thing the vet's going to look at is the records, because on their own, in their own words, did they make a mistake? Did they do something that's actionable? And that's why, if there isn't, a breach of the standard of care that led to the damages, then we don't take the case. We can't. And,
Yeah.
we try to tell the people, that look, this is actually better, because you're not going to then spend money on your case trying to bring it to court, and when you don't really have a clear chance. And as hard as it is, you just sometimes have to accept, and that bad things sometimes happen, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault. But a lot of people that we've taken, we've gone to veterinarians for the review, sometimes the vets will explain to them what happened, and it may be like a couple weeks or a month later, but they call back and they say, I appreciated that I had a chance to find out what happened. And sometimes it's just answers that we need, maybe not even that it was somebody's fault. So I totally see what you're saying there. And that's why I think I come off a little harsh sometimes, because like the things I have seen, they've been through those screens, they've been through the screen of where if somebody did something wrong, and even if they did something wrong and it didn't cause your animal to die, like a lot of times we see it in cancer, where an animal had cancer and then the vet made a mistake, but it wasn't because of that mistake that the animal died. You know,
It was,
if it hurt them or if it increased their pain or something, well, yeah, well, you know, we'll try to do something. But if it was just something, you know, that was a mistake and it had no consequence, you know, then it's not really something that you go forward on, because that's, you know, that's not the point of this. The point is to stop the bad vets. Because I think about the article, and I'm sure, you know, Dr. Dodds has seen this article, but it's the one by Marty Becker, you know, that says, you know, vet confessions, you know, I lied when a pet died. And that's one of the things I remember seeing kind of earlier on, you know, when I started this, and thinking, gosh, I really hope that doesn't happen. But I do see that, you know, I see that, you know, that's where the bigger issues come in, you know, like when you get concealment, you know, like, because I know a lot of people ask questions about fraud, and it's like, fraud is very hard to prove. It's not the most, you know, it's not the most common thing that you see in malpractice. It can happen, but it's usually covering up a mistake. It's
yeah,
usually after the fact. You know, the only types of fraud we usually see are like, I shouldn't say it like that, because the courts are, you know, they're reluctant to to allow cases to proceed on fraud, because they think that's, you know, it's hard. Fraud, it's a big word, but it's usually when somebody, you know, if they're advertising they can do things that they can't, or if they're, you know, making really clear misrepresentations, like, oh yeah, we're totally going to, you know, do all these x-rays, and they don't do them, then that's different. That's fraud. That's intentionally telling you that they're doing something and they're not. It's not just a mistake. But
yeah.
but with the mistakes, you know, yeah, it's a hard, I guess a kind of a hard conversation, you know, to have with the clients, if there really wasn't something that the vets could have done, or, you know, that they did do everything that they could do. And, you know, even though it's hard
Yeah.
to hear right then, they do appreciate it later on.
Later on,
Yeah.
and when you're talking about, it's the cancer that took them, not the mistake that took them.
Right.
And you know, a lot of times people just, like we always talk about, they just want to blame, because if it's not the veterinarian's fault, then it's their fault, is how they feel. And they don't want it to be their fault, so they're going to find a way for it to be their fault. So, but if 40 other dogs would have had that same thing happen that didn't have cancer and didn't die, right? That's what you're saying. And
Mhm.
then therefore it's not the veterinarian's fault. So it's interesting, because the one case that I have always talked about on this show, and why I always say I'm such a good person to do this show, is because I've been accused of negligence in my business, and it was horrible. And a dog had passed away that had a collapsing trachea and was very, very old and had a myriad of medical problems. And she came in for a bath, and then I guess later that night she had a stroke, and so the mom thought that we were the cause of it. And I showed her the video, and she said that because we, you know, bathed her dog in water, how we had the hose, that's what killed her dog. But 9,000 other dogs that I've bathed exactly the same way have never had a stroke at night. And I was trying to help her understand that, but you know, emotions get in the way, and it's such a hard.
Like people have an elderly dachshund that has chronic cardiovascular for months and months and months, and all of a sudden she goes to the veterinarian for a checkup and passes out. She can't be. She was perfectly going down the street to visit a neighbor just yesterday. I said, Fix Junior, you know, the guy that was the marathon runner.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if you've got a cardiac disease, you can just die.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything anybody did, and they couldn't understand that.
They can't. And
Yeah.
and it's so hard, and it's very hard. I almost quit my business over that, because it's very hard. And I see veterinarians doing that as well. They're just done being blamed for things that they didn't do, which is why I told Scott the other day, I'll continue this fight for as long as I live, because I cannot stand to see these pets dying from veterinary malpractice, and I want the laws changed. I want them to be seen as, you know, companion animals or whatever we have to do, but they can't be seen as a toaster. I can't continue to watch that happen, because I think it gives the bad actors an out. It makes them not hire enough people, which, going back to the question I had asked you earlier, Dr. Dodds, why do you think veterinary malpractice continues? Obviously, a big part of it is COVID. We've seen a huge increase since COVID, but
Right.
the worst veterinary malpractice I ever saw was 30 years ago. And so I would say one of the biggest reasons why veterinary malpractice happens is because of understaffing. I
And
think
look at
a
all the
lot.
people that adopted an animal from the pound. Then they went back to work and they threw them back at the pound.
Yeah.
right? All the pets that were going from the pounds and shelters have now been dropped back off there because it's too much trouble to take care of them now that we've gone back to work. Well,
Yeah.
gosh, you're just using that animal as a prop,
Yeah.
some sort of way to make you feel better when you can't do something, and then you don't care about them when you can. That's terrible.
It is. It's absolutely terrible. And that's probably the group of people that do think of them as property, right? The little pocket
Right,
dog that can fit in their purse
right.
and they're an accessory. And so and that is part of the problem is you have certain people who will always continue to think it's just a dog. Um, and then you have the other side of it. But so we're coming up on the hour. So Jerry, you've been so silently sitting there. We haven't forced Jerry to be quiet. We didn't tell him to be quiet. It's just that Jerry plays a very, very important role in this, although he is not a veterinarian or an attorney or someone like me who's just been in the industry forever. He is a absolute pet lover and agreed to come on as an author to write. If you haven't got it, this is the book that Jerry Rock wrote. It's a collection of stories and just sad stories that they're hard to read about veterinary malpractice. But Jerry, tell us a little bit. I know you're on book 2. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the documentary for a little bit. How's the book going?
The book sales are going. The documentary is going. The funding is coming in, but it's coming in slow. A 3-year project, but I hope not. I do want to address one thing that you said, Kara. Other people have said. I have approached a very famous rights activist, a Hollywood star who is against animal abuse, and the answer that I got back is that we could. Joey's could not use her name because she was not going to get involved in any kind of veterinary bashing. Now, it was explained that this is very board bashing, which to me is a real swamp. It's like Washington, D.C. from what I've seen so far. But my did not ask her was, how can you be against animal abuse except when the veterinarian does it? I mean, abuse is abuse. It doesn't really matter who does it, but you're absolutely right. Veterinarian, and it's a very small percent of veterinarians that get involved in this, and it's the cover-up that's the really bad part. But from what I've seen from my research, it's less than a veterinarian, and their malpractice insurance runs about $300 or $400 a year, compared to a doctor or OBGYN who's about $250,000 a year, and that makes it very hard for people to take the cases. Dogs have DNA, lawnmowers do not. They are not property, they're animals, they're alive. And it's change, and that's one of the things that I believe Joey's legacy is attempting to do, and all the people on this panel are attempting to do is, first of all, let's call it a spade, and that is alive as dead. Dead. Dogs are not property, cats are not. Whatever your pet is, it's alive. And we need to get the courts to better define that. And I think that that's what the books do. There's 40 cases in those books. When people say, well, I've never met a bad veterinarian, well, there's 40 people in the first book that have met bad veterinarians. And then they go through the rest of their life feeling guilty because they chose the wrong veterinarian through no their own. I would say to find your veterinarian, like a lot of people do, but most all of them are good. As far as the documentary goes, I'm meeting with the producer Maura. He's filming in Atlanta, so we're going to have dinner. He's waiting for us to get at least half the money. The target is 100,000. We got right at 30,000. At 30,000 in 3 or 4 months. And right now, I believe that Scott, and maybe you too, Carrie, are working on finding maybe a substantial investor that may be interested in investing in this for a piece of the action, so to speak. John told me that once they go to Sundance Theater to sell these, the films usually sell for anywhere from 50,000 to 500,000, and then every time it's shown, there is money that comes in that would help Joey's legacy tremendously, and it needs. The other thing is John said he's got a documentary right now that's in its 7th year, running weekly. That's a lot of money. So if we can find an investor, I think that's willing to, it's going to take to 100,000 with $100 donations. I'm glad to have them, but we need a $70,000 or a $75,000 donation. And there's people out there that if they know, they will do it. And I would expect that could happen. They could get a 20% return on the money per year. That's a lot better than you're going to get most places. And I think that's kind of the avenue we're going to have to do. It's going to be drawn out for a long time. We can wait 3 years, but there's going to be a lot of dead animals in 3 years. Have not gotten this out. We have a great platform here. Scott's done a wonderful job in getting a book done and now getting this done. If we can get it done, the whole world's going to see it, and the whole world needs to see it. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
We have tried to get the, kind of went the approach with if all of our followers would just donate $5. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case, because if it had been, we would probably be a lot further along. I'm with you, Jerry, and yes, Scott and I are working on trying to get bigger investors. And it's weird because I got involved in this not ever thinking, actually my whole business was not to make money. I just do it because I love it. I got involved in this because
Bless you.
Thank you.
to be done. But as we're getting further along, I realized that, I suppose there is some money to be made off of doing a documentary for somebody who is an investor who is only interested in the money. And I'm not against finding that person. I don't care if they like animals, if they want to see this documentary as a investment. So we're going to start reaching out to investors and kind of try to get that. The problem with that is, how long does it take, and how many animals, as Jerry says, do they have to die before we can get the laws changed? And why the documentary is so important is because that will reach further and wider, more people, and the laws get changed. That's how things get changed. You just have to have more backing. We have all these fabulous veterinarians. I know, Jerry, you had mentioned that this is more of a veterinary board bashing. I'm going to kind of intervene there a little bit. I don't think that, at least my intention is not to bash anybody necessarily, but the board definitely needs some revamping. We need to change the veterinary boards. I think we need to have not just veterinarians on the board. I think that's a problem, because it's very difficult for a veterinarian to go against another veterinarian. So I think we need to have maybe some pet parents on there and different people on the board that can kind of make a difference. And I think that getting the laws changed will make a difference. There'll be more skin in the game, right? If there's no skin in the game, then there's no change. And so we have to do that a little bit. But that doesn't mean by all means that we are still taking donations.
Yeah, what I've seen the veterinary.
Go ahead.
That they're kind of like police unions. Police unions have never seen a cop they didn't love, and veterinary boards have never seen a veterinarian they didn't love. It doesn't matter how many complaints have been filed by you or me or anybody else. They love them, and they're going to fight for them, and they sell them the malpractice insurance, and it is just a great swamp. And that's something that I never knew. I've had Great Danes for 35 years. I've used the same veterinarian in a veterinary clinic. I've never had the first problems. I was very shocked when I was pulled. And now that I've got a book with 40 stories and another one coming out with 35 more stories, it's not like it doesn't happen. And veterinary board covers it up. That needs to stop.
Yeah. It needs to stop. And we just keep going, and we'll keep doing what we're doing and keep working towards getting this documentary made. We're past our hour. So I always want to end this with, what can we do now what is it like if you have a sick animal and you're going to a veterinarian? How do you prevent veterinary malpractice? I'm going to give you one way. Unfortunately, it's only going to work for people who are here in Southern California. So one way I'm going to tell you you can make sure you're not a victim of veterinary malpractice is you could go see Dr. Jean Dodds. So I say that wholeheartedly because the integrity is so important of a veterinarian. And Dr. Dodds has just been someone that I value so much, and I'm so lucky that she's here in Orange County because I trust her. That doesn't mean you're always going to get the answer that you want, but you're going to get at least the truth. And her lovely experience that she has is so invaluable. I can't like it's just what you see, right, Dr. Dodds? So, but what else? That's my advice for people who are locally is make sure that your veterinarian is somebody that you really, really do know that you can trust, not just because they're nice to you, because sometimes there's a lot going on. But Dr. Dodds, what advice can you give our listeners to help protect them?
What?
How do our listeners protect themselves from veterinary malpractice? What can they do?
We need to get recommendations, other friends and family and whatever. We have two colleagues working with me now. One in and she did her PhD with us in animal nutrition in Italy, and she applied for a working permit. Millions of people apply, and she won the lottery.
Wow.
And she's coming to her.
Well, I'm going to put her on the podcast.
Wonderful, lovely lady who comes from Peru, and she's smart, and we are so excited. For us or what?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I'm going to have to get her on the podcast.
Oh, yes, definitely. You'll love her.
Yeah. The more the merrier. We're just, we just don't have very many really good holistic, good character, all of that stuff that you need in your veterinarian. So excited. So
we're delighted.
So getting recommendations
yes,
really
from other people, from family friends who have been to veterinarians, and and come to see us for sure. We're booking in October now. We're very busy.
Yeah.
But we're not care work. We just do holistic medicine. So we work with community, other veterinarians, and we work very well together with them.
And so for our listeners that are not local, Dr. Dodds, you do consultations, right? So they can get a second opinion from you.
They can get a consultation from us, right? And as you know, I do not charge.
So, God bless you. I can't stress enough to all of our listeners how important second and even third opinions are before you make these final decisions on what you're going to do and you're going to regret it. If you are living in an area where there may not be a holistic veterinarian, there are lots of them out there. Well, I shouldn't say lots. There are a few of them out there like Dr. Dodds that are willing to look over your case and read it and figure out what the best plan of action would be. So second and third opinions are going to also help you, I think, from veterinary malpractice. Don't be pushed into any veterinarian who's, you have to do this right now, or, I can't see you for 6 months, or, very rarely is your dog going to die the moment you walk out the door. So those may be the cases in some cases, but I would say second and third opinions, use Dr. Dodds for doing those. And
people in their area too, if they need to see somebody.
Awesome.
We have many colleagues all over the country, and actually that we can refer people to.
There you go. There's because although we have our big goal, right? We also have sick animals right now, and we need to protect those while we can and get the laws changed. Anna, what can we do? I know that you unfortunately see it after it's already happened, but how do we ensure that after it's happened that we have the best case to present in front of the judge?
Well, I mean, I have a pre-warning too, though. Check online, check the disciplinary boards, because those are all publicly searchable. So check to see if the vet you're using or the clinic has been reported, because you can always ask them about it. You can say, hey, what happened here? And if they're really defensive, then maybe that's a red flag. Also check to see if they've been sued. Most states have a searchable database. You may not get the documents, but you may be able to see if they've been sued, because in a lot of cases there are settlements, and those settlements have a non-disclosure so that you may not ever know what actually happened, aside from looking up the publicly filed documents. But in having it, the best case is always make sure you do a little research ahead of time. And I'm not saying you have to be an expert in it, but maybe look it up and say, oh, hey, I wonder if it's this. And most vets are not going to be offended if you ask them, hey, I looked this up and here's what it said. Am I way off base here? You can ask the questions. I mean, obviously, you don't want to take up the entire time with them. You want them to be able to look at your animal, but ask them questions. Find out, are there side effects? Are there risks involved? Because sometimes veterinarians are very busy. With COVID, we've seen a lot of miscommunication. It's been a huge issue. And, ask them, do you have the drug sheets? Because a lot of times they won't give you that insert that comes with it. They don't think about it, but, ask for it. Maybe you'll see on there's an FDA warning like, hey, I shouldn't use this on a cat that
100%.
has kidney disease.
Yep.
So start, look into that stuff. Don't just take your word for it. I mean, verify, look it up, see if there's some things that have gone on, because your companion animal better than anybody else because you spend the most time with them. So look that up, get your records every time you leave. If they say I can't do it, well, hang on, I guess I'll wait. Why can't they enter what they did? There's no reason they can't do that. Have it printed out. And ultimately, if time permits and things like that, you can ask them, what are your thoughts on the human animal bond? Because it's important to me that my vet recognizes that, and if they don't, I understand right now that it's a, beautiful place to be where you don't have to suffer in many places, you don't have to suffer that loss, of income that they may suffer, if there were a full recognition of the human animal bond. And I'm not saying that to say like, wow, I hope, to be that this turns into an ambulance chasing type of situation for for animals. Like, no, it's what holds people accountable. If there's no meaningful liability for mistakes, those mistakes will never, they will continue to happen. There's no incentive to change them. So ask about the veterinarian's reputation, ask about these things ahead of time, and definitely get your records. Look things up on the internet, get your second opinions. They're all extremely important. I've done that with my own animals. I've had consultations. I've sent their records to other veterinarians, paid them for the review, and said, please tell me, does this look right to you?
Yeah.
And it's, it's sometimes hard. Everybody's busy, but it's important.
Yeah.
And having the best case, you just want to, be able to have all of your ducks in a row, to be able to, to have crossed your T's, dotted your I's, looked over every, scenario you could. And sometimes, if your review turns out that there wasn't a mistake that you can go forward on, you know what? That may be the best way, because you don't want to spend thousands and not be able to recover, anything. And then that's devastating just the same. So you want to make sure you have a clear case and can bring it forward.
Yeah. Really quick, we do have a question that came across from Mari. She says, are all vets that treat your pet in an ER or an animal hospital, do they have to be licensed?
If they're doing any treatments, they have to be licensed. If a licensed veterinarian in the practice and another non-licensed person is there, not a problem. California has just said now that this whole issue of reciprocity, California and New York State were the only two states that would not accept federal licensed states. They've just thrown that out. It's gone because so many corporate practices bring people in from other states and they can't practice because they don't have a license, for example, in California. That's ridiculous. If they're licensed and they're working by the same federal other state, they should be allowed to. So that's an interesting issue.
Right, it's the national standard, the standards of care. That's why you can have other veterinarians, like from different states, review the case, because it's generally considered a national standard of care. It's just that the licensing per state, it's very similar. I understand there's some slight differences, but the veterinarians who are practicing in that state are going to be held to the license, to the requirements in that state, as well as whatever liability.
now would years to do that, but the corporate practice carry has a huge clout now. That individual veterinarians didn't have much clout.
So you broke up a little bit. I just want to make sure it's clear. So I think you said that a veterinarian who's not licensed can work in a veterinary hospital.
Absolutely, and they can do to do as long as the licensed veterinarian on the facility that's authorized it. Okay.
And that's so it's not. It wouldn't be considered, Anna. It wouldn't be. Mari's next question is this considered fraud if the veterinarian does not have a license?
No, not at all.
Well, it depends on the situation. If they are performing, like let's just say this is a veterinarian who went to vet school but didn't get licensed, and they're performing, actions of a fully licensed veterinarian, then yeah, they're in a lot of trouble there.
Yeah.
But if it's somebody who is working in a clinic that has other veterinarians, and they simply are essentially the role of a technician, if you will, or somebody who's being overseen by the veterinarian, then it's not necessarily that. But typically speaking, yeah, it would really kind of depend on the circumstances, and you'd need a little bit more detail there to be able to say. But I mean, like, I couldn't set up shop in my garage and start performing surgeries. I mean, I may have seen hundreds of spays, hundreds of neuters. I can't do that because I'm not licensed, and that's where I think the difference is. But in somebody who went to vet school, they would still have to be licensed. But if they're working under people, because I think that happens sometimes in the veterinary emergency clinics, where they're all of their actions, if they're working at the clinic, they're going to have to be approved and overseen by a fully licensed veterinarian in that particular state.
That's a young woman we're having come in November. She'll be writing the California license exam. Anything other than be there, and with a license on staff.
So, Mari, I'm on to question that I'm getting. You don't give me enough information, but she's basically says no license yet. He said he was a veterinarian with a business card. I think what we would need to know is
that's
what happened. Was he working with a veterinarian and he handed you a business card? I don't really know the whole story it says he performed full veterinary treatment. But he didn't have a license. Was he working with a veterinarian, Mari? Can you tell us a little bit? In an ER room. It was in an ER room. It's doubtful he would be the only vet in an ER room, right? I mean,
right. He wouldn't be, no.
Yeah, wouldn't be. Probably
wouldn't have him there. He's probably helping the in the ER at the time.
And that's the state?
Well, he's acting as a technician, as Anna said. And in an emergency situation, an animal's going to die. This person who is qualified but not going to just let the animal die, they're going to try to help, right, with the other people there that are licensed.
Yeah. So I
mean, like Good Samaritan, for example. What about a person who's injured in a Good Samaritan person's life? They're not practicing illegally. They try to save a life.
Right.
Right, Anna?
I think, there's little nuances in the law, so it's hard to make a blanket statement there because, yeah, it's a whole course in law school. but I would say, like, generally speaking, with each of the state's laws, if they are working under a veterinarian and at the direction of a veterinarian, that's typically like the role of a technician. The only times I've had like fraud involved where somebody was saying that they were a vet is that they were a veterinarian in their home country, but they came to this country, were advertising that they were a veterinarian, and they in fact were not. They were actually just selling dogs. They weren't doing the things, they were pretending to do, were pretending to do things that a veterinarian would do. But they were really just selling dogs. There has been another situation where I think the disciplinary bodies can actually go after somebody who is not properly licensed. Like if a technician is doing surgeries without the approval of the veterinarians in place. And, it's Illinois. We've had that kind of thing happen here. But that's more of a situation where if there's a rogue technician just doing things, kind of taking over the helm when it's the veterinarian who's supposed to be doing it and the veterinarian wasn't overseeing it, then you're getting into some really, really murky, bad areas, potentially fraud,
So this is what this looks like. So it was an emergency room vet hospital. he was the only vet there on the property during the day, and everyone else on the property at the time were techs. Is he still allowed to act as a veterinarian because a veterinarian owns the practice?
No.
He has to have them on the
Yeah.
premise with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
doing
some states veterinary practice. It has to be a non-veterinarian, which is pretty weird also. There's
Wow,
some
that is weird.
yeah, really weird. Yeah.
Yeah, in
No,
California,
owning the practice, if there has to be a licensed person on the facility where is doing whatever they're doing if they're not licensed.
I think that's what she was trying to get
Yeah.
at. He's unlicensed. I don't know what happened with her cat or her dog. It doesn't give me that much information, but apparently whatever happened, he didn't have a veterinarian there, just himself and some techs.
It definitely sounds like something to follow up with one of the
into.
local attorneys and maybe the disciplinary body to ask, for, because they, granted, they may not be the most powerful, but if they get enough complaints, they usually will take some action.
Yeah, I mean, the veterinarian that owned the practice presumably would have been licensed, but what happened? I mean, did that person have a stroke or something and had to go to the hospital? I mean, what are the circumstances that could explain why the person wasn't there at the time? There could be some I'm not defending anybody. I'm just saying there could be extenuating circumstances.
There can be. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The only thing I'm getting now is that her dog was diabetic, but we need so much more information. So, but definitely Anna is saying, Mari, and even Dr. Dodds is saying, this is something that you definitely should look into further.
Right.
You could contact Joey's Legacy and have maybe Dr. Dodds review the case more clearly, and then it can maybe, I don't know what state you're in. I don't have that information, but Anna, you can only handle cases in the state of Illinois, correct?
Correct. Yes, and that's true for like all attorneys. We're licensed by state, so we can only handle the states, or cases that arise in the state that we're licensed in, and that's because then there's general principles of law, but every state is different in the nuances of how they treat these, and that's why you have to use a veterinarian, or sorry, you have to use an attorney who's licensed in your state. So for me, it's state of Illinois and District of Columbia. So that's where I'm limited. And even there, even within the state, sometimes you're going to want to find an attorney who is in that locality, because I can tell you Chicago is very different than Southern Illinois and Central Illinois. So it's really important, not just for the fact that yes, it's licensing is very, very important. It's key. You have to be licensed in that state, but also for the strategic aspect of it, you want someone who's going to be in the jurisdiction where you have to bring your case to be telling you, here's the reality of what our courts are like.
Right. Well, Joey's Legacy has attorneys all over the country, veterinarians all over the country. So for any of our listeners, whether it's happened to you or it has happened to one of your friends, I would encourage you to reach out to Joey's Legacy so you can have it reviewed by a veterinary board. Sometimes it'll be what you're thinking, and sometimes it won't. But what I do know is both the veterinarians and the attorneys on Joey's Legacy's organization have the utmost respect for your pets, and they're going to tell you the truth. They're going to guide you in the right direction. So it's worth trying. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. Annie, I know it's way past, probably, I don't know what your bedtime. If I were in Chicago, it'd be past my bedtime right now. So want to thank you both for being here. I think we lost Jerry. I know it's like midnight for him. But thank you guys again for joining me and being part of this organization with Scott and just helping change the way we see our pets. It's happening. It's going to happen. I know it's happening when the AVMA is coming out with the counter to our argument, right? No, so it is, we are making some change. So
yeah,
you being part of that.
Agreed.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Have a good evening.